Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the Connecting Corruption, Compliance, and Cybercrime panel of 3Cs 2022. This is a very powerful panel, and I have with me some very powerful panelists and speakers as well who will be able to address it. The whole theme of 3Cs is focused this year on sustainable development, good governance, and its role on achieving the sustainable development of the Caribbean. Critical to that is our understanding not only of each of the three individual evils of corruption, money laundering, and cybercrime, but also how they're connected. And that's exactly what this panel is intended to address. More importantly, it will look at some of what we've discussed, well, all of what we've discussed over the last 2 days here at 3Cs 2022. Look forward as well in terms of looking at solutions, impacts on the region, positive and negative, as well as any emerging trends. With me today are Jason Manar, who is the Chief Information Security Officer at Kaseya, Shelley Nicholls-Hunte, and Josh Drayton. I'd like to ask each of them to introduce themselves, and I'd like to start with Jason.
Guys, thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I think you reminded me it's 4 years in a row. It's hard to believe it's that long since you put together the inaugural 3Cs conference. I think that was the inaugural one back 4 years ago. And as you said, the whole purpose of that event when we were back in person is to bring awareness, education, help provide you unique tools and abilities to ensure that you can help secure yourself against adversaries that would seek to do you harm. Unfortunately, that's the world and the landscape in which we live. I'm all too familiar with that. I spent 16 years in the FBI before I came over to Kaseya as the CISO. I've spent almost 2 decades in cybersecurity. I've seen both the good, bad, and the ugly. I've seen everything that would affect a small mom and pop store and bring it to its knees as far as cybercrime, all the way up to Fortune 50 companies. I've seen what they've done right. I've seen what they've done wrong. It's really provided me a holistic approach so that I can help others learn a little bit of the knowledge that I've been very fortunate over the last 2 decades to acquire. What we want to ensure is that you leave here with those tools that are oftentimes simple to implement, and make sure that we take away any of the preconceived notion that whether it's cybercrime, whether it's compliance, or whether it's corruption, that these are things that they are too hard to understand or too complex to tackle. It's just not the case. So I have a wonderful panelist here that are going to help me do that here in the coming minutes. And I'd just like to thank you once again for allowing me to be at yet another 3Cs conference, and look forward to speaking with you guys.
Thank you, Jason. And it's always a pleasure to have you. We enjoyed hosting you as early as 2018 here in Barbados, and we've enjoyed having you on 3Cs every year since, contributing your usual very helpful insights and demystifying things and doing what you're known best for, which is really breaking things down into very simple ways, giving our audience really great takeaways. So thank you, and welcome again to the panel. Shelley Nicholls-Hunte, as I've grown to know you as a stalwart in the area and respect your work as well as your contributions, I know you always bring it to 3Cs, and I'm very, very happy to have you again this year. Please introduce yourself and your work, and in the context of the conference, you've seen so far. Share a little bit, please, about what you're seeing and how it interacts with your work.
Sure. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Toussant, my fellow panelists, and all the participants here from all over the world. I'm glad to be a part of the conference again this year. As I always say, the criminals, they collaborate well. They cross all sorts of barriers, geographical barriers, language barriers. And so, we tend to feel we tend to be a one step behind them. But when we have such a think tank going on this week, the last 2 days, and having experts come around the table and speaking about it. It's very exciting. Actually, it's I call it a meal, Toussant. It's a meal, a great full course meal, where we can talk and discuss these areas that affect us in all of our jurisdictions. I am an attorney at law by profession for over 23 years. So I have the legal, working at the Financial Intelligence Unit. I was there for almost 14 years, and I left as the Director of Financial Intelligence Unit. For most of those years, I was a director of the Financial Intelligence Unit. So the FIU, Barbados FIU, as being an administrative type FIU, we were quasi law enforcement and lots of, wearing many hats and so on. So we bring a bit of the appreciation of the law enforcement sector as well. And now I am in the private sector, where I'm the Chief Legal and Compliance Officer at Barbados Workers Union, Cooperative Credit Union Limited, and I've been there for 2.5 years. And we're the third largest credit union in Barbados. And so I've had the privilege of being in the public sector space, in the private sector, and appreciating the nuances from both sides. Same coin, as I always say, same coin, just different perspectives. And we hope to have a good marriage in between the private and public sectors, so that we can ensure that the collaboration and the discussion continues. And so even as we discuss these areas of money laundering and corruption and cybercrime, we know, technically speaking, that we can have all types of crimes being predicate offenses for the money laundering offense. And years ago, the Caribbean was seen as one of the regions that was not very, quote unquote, famous for prosecuting for money laundering. The Caribbean countries felt more comfortable with the predicate offense, the theft, the murder, no, not even corruption. It was maybe bribery here and there, and very old pieces of legislation. And so it's been awesome to see how the Caribbean has evolved. Yes, kind of like diamonds in a rough with some pressure and so on. Yes. But to see how the Caribbean countries have evolved and how we've been able, through technical assistance, to help each other and to be able to grow, to be able to fight and combat these areas that all are predicate offenses for money laundering. So it is good to do that. And as we do that, then our level of compliance rises and improves, so that when it comes to issues of de-risking and all sorts of other areas which we'll get into, we can start to say that our backs are getting broader, we're getting stronger, we are creating our own jurisprudence. We don't always have to rely on things coming, from larger countries. That the Caribbean now is developing its own, knowledge base and knowledge hub in this area. So it's fantastic to see that development. So I'm glad to be part of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shelley, and really, really happy to have you. We're also very happy to have Josh Drayton, who has also been a friend of 3Cs. He's been there from the start, and this panel was carefully selected to ensure that we have persons who have had the benefit of interacting with us for a very long time and understand as well our audience, which currently is about 1,200 people we have from probably close to 50 countries by now, I think, online. What I'd like to ask you, Josh, is to do two things. Firstly, introduce yourself. And secondly, react to the fact that so far across the 3Cs conference over the last 2 days, we've had a keynote by Professor Nicholls-Hunte on the sustainable development, role of good governance in sustainable development, where he addressed topic of lawful but awful practices, and he prescribed a menu of measures we can use to curb them. We also had the experts roundtable on corruption that looked at corruption in the Caribbean with a number of prescriptions about how to treat with that. Then today, we also had a panel that we just finished on our two panels, one of which you were on. The first one had to do with youth, education, and corruption. And the second one on sports corruption, which just finished a short while ago. Share not only about your own expertise in this area, but also what do those panels mean to you, and would mean and should mean to an audience? What are your views on how those were covered in the content?
Thank you very much, Toussant. And first, let me say congratulations to the CDB on putting on such an exceptional conference. And thank you for inviting us at CARICOM IMPACS to be a part of this conference. Perhaps it's a good place to start with who are we at CARICOM IMPACS. Most of the audience may not be aware of the Caribbean Community Implementation Agency for Crime and Security, that's CARICOM IMPACS. That's responsible for crime and security, strategy, policy within the entire Caribbean. So we're speaking to Toussant about 15 member states, 5 associate states, and we do have connections with both the French as well as the Dutch and also the Latin Caribbean countries. At CARICOM IMPACS, we focus on crime and security as a whole, but we recognize the transnational nature of crime. And therefore, we focus on things such as cybercrime. You had Mr. Dale Joseph, who's our cybercrime policy expert at CARICOM IMPACS, who participated in some of your panels. And at CARICOM IMPACS, I'm the financial crimes and asset recovery specialist. My role really is to provide a lot of technical oversight into several of our programs. So for example, at this point, right now, as we speak, we have a session for prosecutors in international cooperation, which is a part of a section of our project focused on building the capacity of judicial officers and prosecutors to hear cases and prosecute cases related to financial crimes. Additionally, we look at technical capacity building for asset recovery units, so financial intelligence agencies and the like. In terms of corruption, it's been my core area of expertise for over 15 years. Coming from an academic background, university background. So my research work, technical papers have been primarily on anti-corruption, political finance, open government, and the like. And clear-cutting areas around corruption. Typically, we focus on corruption as a standalone item, but what I saw from this conference and appreciate is bringing those 3 areas of compliance, specifically in areas of AML, CFT, sanctions, as well as corruption and cybercrime. And I think that's useful for us because as we realize, problems are not to be viewed in silos. Problems are multifaceted. Some people describe problems as a spaghetti bowl, essentially with interrelated parts overlapping each other. And this conference recognizes the need for us as members of the Caribbean, citizens of the Caribbean, to address these problems frontally. So I'll just segue into the 2 major panels that I was on, as well as some of the key takeaways from some of the others that relate to corruption. Most of us know the definition of corruption. Simply put, you can think about it as the abuse of public office or the abuse of power for private or personal gain. That's the most styled one, but there are so many variations, so many things such as bribery, kickbacks, embezzlement, grand corruption. The effect at the end of the day is really the erosion of our democracy and our development. Corruption is really a spear in the heart of the development of the region. And if we're not careful, if we don't address this issue, we realize that we can really curb our development trajectory. And that's the relationship between corruption and development, because it really siphons resources that can be used for developmental purposes. Specifically, when we talk about the SDGs, we're focusing, most of the panels, or the 2 of the panels I was on, kind of focus a lot on strengthening institutions. And I think that's a common theme coming out. How do we strengthen institutions? Sustainable Development Goal 16 speaks about strong institutions, transparent and accountable institutions. And that's what we would like to see. What I found particularly interesting in the first panel that I was on was how in Jamaica, as a particular example, Jeanette spoke about leaning in. Leaning in meaning that we combine our efforts as citizens together to lean in on our governments, to lean in on those wrongdoers in the society and say enough is enough. And that was one of the key elements there, because what JAMP focused on was strengthening existing institutions like the Supreme Order institutions, giving citizens the necessary tools through the use of technology, through the use of data, in order to hold governments to account. And I think that was particularly interesting. I think a lot of us recognize that laws are not just enough. The very existence of law is not enough. In good governance, we speak about not just law, but the rule of law, which is the exercise of that law, but that law is effective in curbing corruption in this instance. So that's another key takeaway, which is laws. There are other elements I want to just talk about briefly, that there's some cross-cutting between the work that is done at the compliance level and what has to be done at the corruption level. And there's a need for greater convergence between money laundering and corruption being seen together, along with fraud, as financial crimes. And that's important for us. So I will end here, but very good takeaways. Civic participation is important for young people to be able to curb corruption. And so sensitization and awareness is important. And I think this conference has done that. So over to you, Toussant.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jason. That was a great summary. We have a question in the chat from the audience that I believe also intersects with a panel that we had this morning, and it concerns your area of work, Jason. This morning, we started with a keynote fireside chat between myself and Brian, who is the cybercrime chief. Brian P. Smith, who's the cybercrime chief for the FBI International, FBI cybercriminal section, sorry. And one of the things that this question is exploring is how can the FBI, through their investigative strategy of collaboration with partners, ensure that there's capacity building extended to the private sector. So this is probably coming from a private sector individual, and to encourage a holistic comprehension and application in the risk and management and control of money laundering, cybercrime and corruption, etc. But where I want to start, Jason, in asking you to expand or touch on this is something that Brian mentioned during his keynote, and also that was covered during your panel. I'm lumping the two together. And that is, you both dealt with, that is Brian's session as well as yours, the explosion in cybercrime. Brian mentioned that the IC3.gov website for reporting complaints to the FBI back in 2015 had about 350,000 complaints with a loss of $2.7 billion. And then by 2021, there were 850,000 complaints with a loss of $6.9 billion. A lot of that might have come from private sector actors who would have used cybercrime at the front end to be able to commit a fraud or some act that would result in a financial loss. Those funds would be laundered, and those laundered funds can also be used to pay corrupt actors at the back end and the front end. That's one way to connect it. But please share a little bit about the response to the question and what has been now we're seeing in sort of the explosion in cybercrime at all levels and in the private sector too.
Yeah, so let's be very clear, because there are no mandatory reporting mechanisms. Whatever data that is in IC3.gov or particular any other data is partial data at best. So we're only seeing a small percentage of what is truly going on out there, which that in and of itself should scare anyone that's listening within the sound of my voice. Because if we're only seeing a fraction of mandated reporting, or those individuals that would want to report, I can guarantee you there's a whole lot of additional information that is not making its way into the portal, which is not being effectively captured. And so it's a much more pervasive problem than we even realize or even know. So what is the FBI? Well, I don't want to just focus on the FBI. Let's look at all entities, and let's look at all governments. Almost every government around the world has some sector that helps its private sector base with either intelligence, a reporting module, or even sheer education, where that they're going to understand the threat landscape. They're going to understand new and emerging technologies. They're going to partner with folks across the private sector to ensure that they have the latest and greatest information. Government is notoriously slow when they provide information. Why is that? It's because of classification levels. It's because they oftentimes get information that has to be declassified. It's oftentimes because they have information in raw forms and they don't want to push that out. There have been several attempts to create portals and several attempts to elicit information in raw forms that would help the private sector even more than what they're currently doing. That wasn't the question. The question was, what are they currently doing? The question is, so what are they currently doing besides providing the threat landscape, besides providing us these statistical analysis based upon information that's coming into them? Well, whether it's the FBI, DHS, CISA, or other organizations out there, they hold trainings. They have groups like InfoGuard. They have groups like DSAC. They have various groups. I know the Secret Service has one off the top of my mind. I can't even think of what it is, but it's for point of sale vendors and private sector individuals that meet, I want to say every quarter, where a lot of the information shared. CISA has various tool sets that will help the private sector with various scanning, again, statistical information, threat information. They even have teams of people to help certain companies with the remediation stage. So there's a lot of government resources out there, but it goes back to what I said before. I don't want to wait for the government or a government entity to help me out. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to take them up on every piece of information that they have. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to be intimately connected within their programs, but I'm going to take it on myself to educate myself, my staff, as to the dangers that exist out there as it relates to cybercrime.
Very much so. Before you go, and in that context of, share a little bit about the work of Kaseya in that space. What exactly, for instance, is your role, and what exactly does Kaseya do?
Yeah, so that's great. So one of the things I saw year over year, time after time, was the annihilation of the little guy. What do I mean by the little guy? I literally was on the other end of the phone as sons, daughters, husbands, wives realized their family dream of starting a bakery, starting a dentist office, starting a small business, but didn't understand the need to secure their network. They didn't understand the importance of cybersecurity. It didn't matter how many times I did events like this or I did speaking engagements around the world, quite frankly, I didn't seem to ever get to enough people, because time after time they would call me and they would say, everything's encrypted. Everything's gone. I have no backups. I don't know what to do. I don't have the money. I don't have the resources to do anything. And I would watch companies implode and fall. And one of the things that my company does is it creates software for the IT professional, and specifically the IT professional for small to medium-sized businesses, as well as managed service providers and managed security service providers. And the way that I try to have people make sense of that, because everybody's like, what's an IT professional? An IT professional is analogous to kind of what the office professional was, back in the day. So if everyone remembers, that's probably my age or a little older, before there was Microsoft and they integrated Microsoft, Word, they integrated Microsoft PowerPoint, they integrated all their products, the office professional would have to spend numerous hours going back and forth between products that didn't talk to themselves. And so Microsoft, what they did was they got all these products together, they created integrations. And if you remember at the time, I remember some of it was frustrating, but it saved me such time because I could literally copy and paste, and it was so much easier. It saved time, effort, redundancy, and it made me as an office employee more efficient. We're doing the same thing for the IT professional. It is so hard to get quality IT professionals. And oftentimes we overload them with tasks. and we overload them with software and things that, quite frankly, don't communicate with each other and don't allow them to be efficient. So we take everything from cybersecurity, billing, payment, remote monitoring, endpoint. Gosh, we have ransomware detection. We have all kinds of products. I want to say 35 different modules and products that we have all taken under our umbrella, and they all communicate. Just like Microsoft did with the Office Professional, we have been singularly focused on the IT professional who will help that mom and pop store, who will help that MSP that will eventually secure those individuals. And it brings me great joy every single day to work alongside people who are constantly working towards making the life of that IT professional better.
Thank you. And that's really important, because some of these roles are not well known in the region, or if they do exist, they're not well known, or they don't exist at all. So I think it's important for those of us in the region to recognize the evolution of some of these roles and the access to that type of information and type of service to be able to treat with cyber threats. And cybercrime risks is also the resolution aspect of it. Shelley,
Yes,
there's a lot I have to ask you about, both in response to some of what Jason and Josh have said, but also to ask you to comment on two very powerful panels we had yesterday. The first was a round table. For the very first time in my memory, or in the history of the region probably, of directors of FIUs being able to meet at a conference that had to do with corruption and cybercrime, and sort of demystify their work and share a lot about, what it means to them and their work in the context of the development of the Caribbean. And secondly, for the first time, we had also a panel that was focused exclusively on the risking of correspondent banking relationships, not drivers and everything, just solutions. And then thirdly, we had a special keynote on sanctions, including Russian sanctions and Venezuelan sanctions, and what it could mean for the region. So if you can, please react to both what Josh and Jason said, and also share your views on any takeaways or insights that you found useful from those three sessions.
Sure. Yes, in terms of what Jason would have shared just now about resources out there available for the private sector, I find that it is exactly a situation where the private sector, perhaps like Jason's company, sector entities having to subscribe and to basically educate themselves. I think that Caribbean governments are still striving a great deal to come to grips with cybercrime, come to grips with all that's required of them to be able to not just reactively deal with cybercrime, but to proactively deal with a particular issue. And we're talking about the equipping and staffing of these units and so on, which is a bit of a challenge with some of them across the jurisdictions right now. So then when it comes to the needs that private sector has, help, I'm hearing lots of things in the media. I'm seeing my partners, my competitors fall to cybercrime, but help. And it's a challenge because my understanding is from speaking to some of them across the region, they want to assist, but they can only do so much at this particular point in time. So even a conference like this is very helpful, where it is you have practitioners being able to break down very simply what is cybercrime. So you have, as Jason said, the mom and pop shops, we're struggling, to understand what that means, as well as the large players. So the large players are expected, but you have the resources to be able to bring in someone to educate your staff and to be able to know what is required. But then, we have various players in the market, and we have to think about the smaller ones, medium-sized ones that may be very much struggling and not be required. You may think that they are not vulnerable until, and I have a personal experience recently where it is a scenario where you have an entity that may have been exposed, and of course, information comes to you all the mailing list of that particular individual, and you could very well be caught and have that entryway into something. So solutions, because we're about solutions, right, Toussant? So solutions, that's something in terms of this being a catalyst, this forum being a catalyst to help to encourage, even the Caribbean cybercrime units to be continue to receive the technical assistance from players like CARICOM, IMPACS, and so on, to grow and develop and have the necessary staffing requirements to be able to assist the countries is very, very important. So that's one good place to start. In relation to the forum on the Heads of FIU Forum, it was very, very, very insightful because we had, I think, about 5 countries there represented, and all at various stages in their anti-money laundering program. Those that would have been, let's say, on lists and have done very well in terms of like an exponential increase at Cayman Islands. We know about the success of Cayman Islands and how well that they've done in terms of their overall development in the legal, law enforcement, and the financial sectors, and those that they still be on the gray list, like Barbados and Trinidad and so on. And being able to hear the common thread of the importance of FIUs was very, very important as being the central agency for the receipt, analysis, and dissemination of intelligence, and to the importance of that collaboration. That's a continuous theme: collaboration, 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 so that as the transnational nature of cybercrime and transnational nature of corruption, we've seen things like that pop up even within our region, that where it is the FIUs are considered to be the center of the AML-CFT regime and touch and concern basically all the predicate offenses. It was good to hear the discussion about the issues that affect the FIUs and so on. So we talked about the issues regarding even the INSER report, for example, and how that affects our jurisdictions and the role that the FIU plays in there, because many times the FIU will be one of the key partner agencies that will vet and collect information from the other agencies in relation to the INSER. This is the International Narcotics Control Strategy Report, and that really would assess money laundering, and being able to hear about these things and at the same time know the effects that that particular report can have on jurisdictions, where it sometimes feels as if you're taking one step forward and 2 steps back, because you're making these strides, and somehow, if I may respectfully say, the process of which the report is finalized and so on begs for more of a collaboration between the governments and the US government, to be able to say, okay, yes, is what we are going to post factually correct, or is it not? Because there's some inconsistencies there in terms of what may be posted and published and what may be factually correct from a jurisdictional point of view. So having that discussion there.
And just on that point, and I think a great point to be made there is that that report being factually correct has grave implications for both the reputational, both on the reputation and financial situation of countries that it affects. One of the things that Jason mentioned during his presentation this morning was about leaving the back door open. You're not going to leave the back door open in the cybercrime context, but the same is true in relation to the anti-money laundering context, in that many nations strive to reach benchmarks, but then out comes a report that makes many nations in the Caribbean that makes very damaging remarks about them, making it appear as if their back door is wide open when it may not necessarily be. So I think just to make that point in there as well. So please continue though, but I just wanted to share that as well.
Yes, sure. I agree with you, 1,000%, Toussant, because that collaboration is very key. Very much like how the mutual evaluation assessments work with the FATF style regional bodies, where it is you have your assessment and you have that dialogue between country and assessment team, and to ensure that the report is as factually correct as possible. That is one missing element, one important missing element from the INSER report. And so it's very important to have that, especially when it is that you have investors who are looking towards that report and other reports to be able to make your determination and investments. So, so that collaboration as a solution, that's a collaboration is very much required, and I believe that Caribbean governments have already represented that, even through the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force and so on. But to repeat that is extremely important. So we've had that panel, and that's just one of the aspects dealt with there in the report, and then the importance of the FIU and its role in the national coordination in terms of fight against money laundering and cybercrime is extremely important, because you have the cybercrime units and so on, and the key phrase is follow the money. So the importance of that collaboration is even more emphasized, and it is to continue. Efforts have been made and strides have been made. Let's now continue to build on those efforts and strides, because we keep saying the criminals are collaborating also very well. And so we need to do a little more. I know there's a concern from a legal point of view of confidentiality, and in terms of, concern whether MOUs are enough and adequate, whether the laws are enough, and so on. But we're building on the framework of the laws and the framework of the MOUs, and to be able, with networking, with fora like this, with fora like the Egmont that we spoke about yesterday, even for those who are in the fold and those who are still to come into the fold, and through CFATF and so on, continue to build that networking so that collaboration continues, even in areas cybercrime is extremely important. So that was
Right.
a fantastic session.
Right, and I want to say, I know you have some more. I'm going to ask you to add them to the wrap up, but I want to say something you just mentioned really caught my attention yesterday. We had the panel on anti-money laundering experts, FIU heads, that included discussions of cybercrime collaboration. We had the panel on corruption as well, talking about cybercrime and anti-money laundering collaboration. I think that's some of the essence of what our panelists actually intend to explore, that even though the issues may have different names and may have different frames, they're all connected, right? And just before we get to the wrap up in the last 10 minutes, I'm going to come back to you, Shelley, on the other two panels. I just want to ask Jason to touch on something. There's a question from the audience on the side that says, as a means to help drive the process, should more pressure be placed on professional bodies? And they're talking about the gatekeepers, like the legal and accounting professions, the legal, like Shelley mentioned, that creates that framework, as well as educational institutions to make ethical and anti-fraud corruption behavior more top of their mind for their member students. I want to mention two things. The first is, last year we had a panel on the private sector, during which they said that of the three, of corruption, money laundering, and cybercrime and corruption and money laundering were very important, but cybercrime was in the upper quadrant to the right, in that their costs were so explosive that they couldn't really chart the thing, and that it was beginning to overwhelm their operations. And then secondly, one of the panels we're going to deal with after this panel is a panel on FTX scandal, the collapse of FTX. That was a complete and utter failure of governance, and that we'll have at the end of it something that covers each of your three respective areas. So I'd like you to kick off the last round, Josh. I'll come to you first, and then we'll go. We have 5 minutes left. I'll come to you first, then I'll go to Jason, and then I'll ask Shelley to close us off. Please go ahead, Josh.
Sure. Thank you very much, Toussant. And I think that this issue of ethical education or ethics education was covered quite a bit on the panel on youth education and corruption, simply because there's a need for greater sensitization. There's a need to understand and, as it were, demystify what these things are, corruption, etc. But I want to just mention one thing that Shelley spoke about in terms of collaboration. And there is something, an organization, a network called the Asset Recovery Interagency Network of the Caribbean, ARIN Carib. And CARICOM is a useful, informal mechanism for mutual legal assistance and deepening that collaboration between law enforcement and prosecutors. So we see a lot of that happening on their front. So I just want to put that plug in for CARICOM because a lot of the times we think that law enforcement prosecutors don't kind of connect in that way beyond that. But coming back to the whole question of ethical behavior and ethical education, there is that need for it. The question is, when do we start and whether it's continuous and sustained? Quite often you have one-off modules, for example, as a part of your professional qualifications on ethics. And that's a standalone module, but there's a need for cross-cutting elements of ethics education across the board. So that's all I will say for now. Over to you, Toussant.
Over to you, Jason. You like to emphasize education and awareness. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, so when we start talking about things to help drive the process, right? And I'm a big process-driven guy. I just keep going back to accountability. And accountability meaning that cybercrime, cybersecurity is a team sport. And if you are trusting or hoping that one single individual is going to be able to do everything and, quote, set it and forget it or any of those things, it's just not going to happen, right? We have to have accountability of everyone within the institution, even if we are, utilizing third-party partners. We have to do our due diligence in those third-party reviews. We have to do our due diligence in ensuring that they're going to meet the needs of our organization. We have to ensure that we are holding ourselves accountable, those around us, and that we have laid out to each and everyone in the company what's acceptable and what's not. In the other session, I gave the example of 50 years ago, it would be completely unacceptable for you to go outside a physical location or a business if you're the last one in that business and leave the doors wide open. I'm pretty sure you wouldn't have a job when you came back. We held those people accountable. I'm asking us to do the same thing with our internal network. I'm asking us to do the same thing with our security posture. I'm asking us to make sure that we're partnering with the right people to educate ourselves. I'm not saying that everyone has to have the knowledge of a CISO out there or a CIO or anyone else, but it's incumbent upon ourselves to make sure we do our due diligence to put certain processes in place that allow high accountability throughout the organization.
Thank you. Shelley, you have the last word.
I agree with all that has been said. Good governance is cornerstone of all three areas in terms of the fight against cybercrime and a fight against money laundering, and certainly in terms of upholding compliance and ensuring that we reach sustainable goals for good, strong institutions, and for both the private sector and on the public sector side. So it is important as we become more aware that we implement, to whom much is given, much is required. Yes. And with more and more responsibility, then it means then that the posture and the position where we would hide our heads in the sand and say, oh, this doesn't have anything to do with me, is long gone, because the interconnectedness is amazing. So we've realized that all of us have to, as they say, proverbially pull up our socks and seek to do better.
Thank you. That was an excellent wrap from each of you. The audience, to you, 1,200 or so of you in all those many countries, I hope that you've been able to glean from this panel a few very important takeaways. The most important of which is that good governance for the sustainable development of the Caribbean and wherever you are is going to be dependent on partnerships. So I'm going to take one word from each of what the panelists on this panel said. It's going to depend, good governance is going to depend on partnerships. And for us to be able to achieve sustainable economic development, we have to treat each of our respective areas, cybercrime, corruption, and money laundering, as a team sport. So in essence, good governance relies on partnerships, and let's treat it as a team sport. And that's the great takeaway. Thank you, Jason, Josh, and Shelley for joining me today. And thank you for the audience as well. All the very best.
Welcome.